It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. We all reacted in horror in the fall of 2015 when images were broadcast around the world of the lifeless body of a 3-year-old Syrian boy named Alan. His family was fleeing the Syrian civil war. He drowned as they attempted to reach Europe, and his body washed up on a Greek beach. There was a clear sense of outrage around the world that such a thing could happen now, and a fear that something was unfolding akin to the great European refugee crisis of World War II, when for years the United States and many countries turned a blind eye to Jews attempting to escape the Holocaust. Germany signaled a willingness to permit large numbers of refugees from Syria and other Middle Eastern countries. Thousands of migrants clogged border crossings in the former Yugoslavia, Turkey, and Bulgaria. Tens of thousands crowded boats headed for Greece. But then something else happened. The arrival of those refugees ferociously unleashed anti-immigrant political parties in Europe. In the United States, Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump said refugees might be terrorists and should be kept out. Huge numbers of Americans applauded. Now, more than 4 million Syrian refugees remain displaced, and millions of others are trapped in hopeless camps and detention centers. In this American Forum, we attempt to sort through this complicated and worrisome situation and what it means for the future of Europe and America's leadership role in the world. Joining us are Kathleen Newland, a co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute and one of the leading voices in the world on refugees and migrants. She's joined by David LeBlanc, who is a political economist at the University of Virginia and has served as a consultant to the International Monetary Fund and the Directorate of Finance and Economics of the European Commission. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
So, that terrible image that we all saw of that little boy, it was haunting to me even looking at it again this morning, did catalyze a tremendous outpouring of concern and interest, really a great expression of humanism all around the world. Has something actually gotten better, Kathleen, or what is the current situation? Why has the crisis faded a bit from the headlines?
I think that's more a phenomenon in the United States than it is in Europe. And one of the distinguishing things about this winter is that the numbers of people crossing the Mediterranean by boat, which usually are very seasonal, it goes up in the spring and the summer, and then it trends down as the weather gets rougher, hasn't happened to nearly the same extent it usually does. There's still 3,000 or 4,000 people a day coming into Greece, and that, I think, demonstrates the sort of measure of desperation that people, not just in Syria, but in Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world that are subject to violent conflict are still feeling.
And the numbers, I want to just run through some of these. This is from the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. 4.6 million Syrian refugees have fled their homes, registered refugees, most of that in the past 2 years. UNHCR is asking for $4.3 billion to care for them. Only a portion of that. There is a significant amount of money that has been raised, but it's only a portion of that. Now, in these numbers, it seems like there's some others that may be slightly different, suggest that about 10% have sought refuge in Europe of those numbers. I've seen others that make me think that's a much larger. But also 7.6 million people displaced inside Syria, 1.2 million in refugee camps in Lebanon, 630,000 in Jordan, 250,000 in Iraq, 130,000 in Egypt. These are really huge, huge numbers. Is it only because these terrible pictures came out of Europe that we began to be aware that these people were in this situation and care about it? Was that really the thing?
Well, I think the power of the image is very considerable, and that photo of young Aylan Kurdi really did humanize the problem. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about real people and about lots of children and families. But there's been a sort of periodicity about the headlines and about the attention to it. in October of 2013, just as the UN was convening a big conference on migration, a boat went down in Lampedusa, just off the island of Lampedusa, within sight of the shore, and almost 500 people drowned on that occasion. That was kind of the first big burst of attention, and then, various, rescue operations were put on, and it faded a little bit, and there was another catastrophe. So it comes in waves, but the power of the image is very much a factor in how much attention we pay to these incidents.
And it seems that, as recently as in late November, I guess, was the point at which that the EU and Turkey reached an agreement about where a significant amount of support would go to Turkey, aimed at essentially dealing with refugees in Turkey, essentially keeping them in their points of entry into the European Union and at the boundaries. Is that the beginnings of some sort of a broader resolution within the European Union that ultimately gives a solution, or does that just put things off?
I'd be hesitant to say that that's the beginning of a resolution, but it's a very interesting pivot on the part of the European Union, especially on the part of Germany, that has not turned a blind eye, but has always been very hesitant about even discussing Turkish membership in the European Union, right? And so part of this discussion that began was not only about European aid going to Turkey, but an actual invitation to begin the conversation about Turkish accession, right? And so that changes the dynamic in terms of the internal dialogue and internal politics within the European Union as a whole, but it also makes one appreciate the enormity of the challenge of dealing with and trying to protect the EU's external borders.
The idea that that there is an explicit quid pro quo, essentially, of that your desire to be part of the European Union will be accelerated and be seen in a significantly different way if you will help with this immediate crisis. But at the same time, it also speaks to this more fundamental question around the stability of the entire European Union and how the migrant crisis seems to be bringing to a head these very big existential questions. It speaks to the thicket of issues that are at work here, far beyond just what do we do about Syrian refugees.
I think that one of the really significant things that's coming out of this crisis now is an insistence of the powerful countries in the EU of taking action, not on a unanimous basis, but on a majority voting basis. So you have the plan to redistribute 160,000 refugees from Greece and Italy and Hungary into other European countries on a mandatory basis, not voluntary. And that was passed over the violent objections of some of the Eastern European member states. But it is EU law. Now, I'll add that it's not happening. Of those 160,000 people who were supposed to be redistributed, less than 500 have moved so far. But the Europeans have also decided to establish a European border force, which they've never had before. It's always been up to the individual states to decide what to do about their borders. It's a big change.
There's a tension here, right? So if we go back three or 4 years, right, just after the Arab Spring, the big concern in the discussions over asylum and refugee policy in Europe had to do with burden sharing. Most of the refugees who were leaving North Africa were ending up in Italy or in Malta. Right? And there was a concern that the rich countries were not doing their part in either taking these asylees or providing funds to help offset the costs that would be borne by these governments. Right? So that's in a sense, this has really brought home the fact that there needs to be burden sharing if there's going to be some sort of common migration policy. But at the same time, these pressures that may drive towards a common set of external policies are also driving the rise of populist parties, radical right-wing parties that are not only anti-immigrant, but a large number of them are anti-EU. Some of them are anti-Euro. Right? So you have that tension going on that could, from the inside, pull the union apart, whereas at the same time, it's the exact factor that you might need to secure the borders and really protect the European Union as a single geographic space.
It's hard to exaggerate both the scale and the pace of this crisis. I mean, Germany has received 1.1 million asylum seekers this year, and that's unprecedented. Sweden, a country of less than 10 million people, has received over about 200,000, including over 30,000 unaccompanied minors. Now, I was talking to a friend who works in the Swedish Ministry of Justice who said, for us, that's the equivalent of 1,000 new classrooms that we need for these kids. That's a lot of classrooms and a lot of teachers in a country the size of Sweden. And many of the countries of Europe, generally, but especially in Eastern Europe, have no experience of settling refugees. And they were sources of refugees themselves not so long ago. And it's a tremendous adjustment. They're ethnically homogeneous, they're religiously homogeneous. Many of these countries, the little Baltic states, just can't imagine integrating people who are so different from what they're used to. And it's going to be a very steep learning curve to the extent that they even get on that curve.
Scale matters, but timing matters as well. We saw the increased popularity and importance of some of these radical right parties. I mean, the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, Golden Dawn in Greece, the AfD in Germany. The thing that has happened now is with the immigrant crisis, you have these parties not only gain in strength within countries, but they're gaining seats, and they're gaining seats at the local level, right? So I made a list because I couldn't remember how many different countries radical right-wing parties had gained some purchase in, and the list is, it's France, Austria, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland. Okay, where they have all gained a political foothold either regionally, locally, or at the national level. And that's really quite different from the blips that we've seen in terms of radical right-wing party support in Europe.
I think what generates a lot of the anxiety is the feeling that the authorities are not dealing with this very well. And an incident like the incidents we saw in Cologne over the New Year holiday with people around the train station, which is a tough neighborhood, being attacked by groups of young men who seem to be of immigrant background. They seem to be mostly have been Moroccan, Algerian, and Tunisian. In other words, not refugees, not Syrians, but that immediately sort of changes the image in people's mind from the helpless toddler to the aggressive young man, and that raises a whole set of anxieties that the authorities have not dealt with very well in most countries. And I think that's what gives rise to the reaction as much as anything else. It's not so much that people don't want immigrants, they just don't want uncontrolled flows. They don't want the uncertainty of where people are going to live and what they're going to do. And Chancellor Merkel has been really a remarkable communicator on this whole issue, but she has not had a lot of company in that.
No, and she's had to backpedal on a lot of the things she said because of conflicts within her coalition.
A big part of the dialogue out there is that, well, the folks who ought to be taking care of these people are not doing it. The people who look like them and are from their culture and are right next to them are not doing their part, and they've got money. They should be taking care of this. Why should it be coming to us? Is that just a distraction, or is there any legitimacy to some version of that narrative?
Well, I think it's legitimate to ask capable countries from any region to contribute to the solution of this global problem, and that includes the Gulf countries. I don't think it's reasonable to expect them to be taking a lot of refugees because they have tiny populations. For the most part, a country like Kuwait, the UAE already have 70-80% of their population made up of immigrants. A lot of those immigrants are Syrians, by the way. There are lots of Syrians living in the Gulf countries. They're just not living there as refugees. And in many cases, people would rather not be refugees if they can be there as businessmen or students or workers or visitors. And being a refugee is not a status that people crave.
Right.
And so I think we sort of underestimate how much, in terms of resources and places to stay, are coming from the Gulf countries. I think the much more salient point for those countries is the extent to which they are fanning the flames in Syria, in Iraq, in the Middle East by supporting radical groups.
That brings us to something that I definitely want us to discuss, which is that you wrote Kathleen, you wrote a very interesting op-ed piece that I think was published on CNN.com a while back, but where you talked about several reasons why, I think it was 3 primary reasons that the United States has a real obligation. It's not just an act of kindness, but that we have some obligations to play a much bigger role here. One of them was simply the leadership that the United States has shown over time, received more refugees than all other countries combined, I think you said, or something like that.
We resettled more. Yeah.
You resettled more. But you also went right at the most sensitive part of that question of the U.S., and that is that so much of the current crisis was precipitated by the acceleration of the Syrian civil war, and that the United States' involvement in the events that led to that, in terms of our invasion of Iraq that set in motion a sequence of events, is what created the anarchy that then or certainly facilitated the anarchy that has triggered this. And I think that, and the idea that I think what you said was, if we broke it, we have some obligation to fix it. What's interesting to me, and I just want to hear you talk more about that, but I also just want to make the observation that it is curious to me that that parallel and how similar it is to the post-Vietnam experience, where at the end of Vietnam, there was a real sense in America that however you felt about the war, it was that we had some obligations, particularly to the Vietnamese who had been on our side. And it's strange to me that it's so difficult for us to create that separation in the way we look at it today.
It's a very different kind of war, both in Syria and in Iraq. In Vietnam, there was a much more well-defined enemy. And in the Middle East these days, you never really know who's a friend, who's an enemy, who's carrying a bomb, who's going to try to blow you up. And I think that affects the way we look at people, including, unfortunately, civilians. And I think there's even more sense of remove from Syria because we didn't cause the war in Syria. I mean, we're implicated in some of the things that led up to it, but Bashar al-Assad caused the war in Syria and set in motion that train of events that created an opening for Daesh, the Islamic State. And I don't really hold the U.S. responsible for the war in Syria in any except a really quite marginal way. But I think the more important point is the humanitarian leadership and the real contribution that makes to the soft power, as the political scientists call it, of the United States. We are seen as a leader in the humanitarian field, or at least we have been. And I think that's a really precious resource, which it would be tragic if we lost.
Why would a president, why would an administration not reach out and grab onto this humanitarian mantle that's there for the taking? And I think it, in a simple sense, it comes down to politics, right?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to one thing: 9/11. That completely changed the attitude toward risk taking, toward any, the idea nobody in the U.S. government wants to be responsible for stamping the visa of somebody who turns out to be a terrorist. And the risk aversion is so extreme, and the sort of misplaced fear, after the Paris attacks, when 31 governors said they were not going to accept Syrian refugees in their states, I just went, what? What does this have to do with Syrian refugees? The answer is absolutely nothing. And since 9/11, when the security protocols for refugees were really ramped up to a very high level and have kept being ramped up since then, since 9/11, we have resettled 785,000 refugees in the United States. There has not been one single attack carried out by a resettled refugee. Now, everyone is saying Boston bomber, right? But the fact is that the Boston bombers were not resettled refugees. They came here as children. Their parents were asylum seekers who came under their own power. So not one single resettled refugee has been implicated in a terrorist attack. It's a really misplaced fear to direct those fears toward Syrian refugees, but people don't make the distinction between resettled refugees, asylum seekers, illegal immigrants, people who look different, Muslims. There's just a lot of confusion. And
what about the parallels between the whole migrant discussion in Europe now and our own migrant debate in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, the parallels are useful if we think about where some of this support comes from. If you think about what we discussed earlier having to do with the rise of support for radical right-wing parties, it comes from people who feel like they are excluded from reaping the rewards or the economic benefits that might exist within a country. The research that studies this finds that support for anti-immigrant sentiment and support for radical right-wing parties really correlates very highly with unemployment rates.
Part of the reason we don't have debate is a tendency to sort of dismiss other people's point of view and say, you don't like the idea of refugees living in your town, you must be a racist. Well, not necessarily. You may be worrying about how are the teachers in the school going to cope with having children who speak 30 different languages that they don't understand. So there are real fears, and I think those need to be acknowledged and addressed in a respectful way.
We've got a project here at the Miller Center called First Year that's very focused on identifying the critical issues that the next president, whoever she or he will be, of whatever party, what are the issues that are going to be immediately on the table in that first year, and to try to bring some counsel to some approaches to those. So let's hear quickly from both of you, though, and let's start with David. If you were sitting down with whoever the next president is and the focus was on this topic right now, what would you say? What would be the 3 bullet points that you would give the new president as she or he began?
The first one would be to become very well versed in executive action, because it is highly unlikely, unless you have, I would say highly unlikely, even with a solid Democrat or solid Republican Congress and president, that you're going to get comprehensive immigration reform through the legislative branch. So my advice would be focus on executive action and see where and how executive action can be used to try and make or reinforce or clarify immigration policy. So that would be thing number one. Thing number two would be to talk about some of the things that we have talked about, which is the effect that immigrants have on our culture, on society, on the ability that we have to educate the young people in this country, and also to point to some of the really good academic work that's been done that shows that there's no effect of immigrants on wages. That's enough for 2 terms.
More than enough. I guess my number one item would be accept more Syrian refugees, and then really go out aggressively and make Americans proud of our generosity. I think there is a basic instinct toward generosity in this country, and as you said, we all have immigrant roots and have had this experience in the not too distant past. So I think, use social media, work with young people, and really invest in integration. That I think is the recipe for success.
Well, one thing that's clear is that many versions of this issue, of this core issue of not just how the United States is changing, but the world is changing around around the way that people come together, what economies they can be a part of, the tensions that all creates. This is an issue that's going to be facing whoever's a guest on American Forum 30 or 40 years from now. And so it's the long ball that leaders have got to be looking at with this. But thank you both so much, David LeBlanc, Kathleen Newland. We hope you will join the conversation with American Forum on the Miller Center Facebook page or by following us on Twitter at Douglas Blackman or at American Forum TV. To send us a comment about this program or download podcasts or transcripts, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next week. Thank you.